For 20 years, she warmed the house before the household woke. Rosa Hernandez moved through the hacienda at the hour when light still hesitated on the valley. The fog folded low over the sugarcane, and the cook fire breathed a slow blue. Her hands knew all the secret roads of the place, the rounded lip of the clay mug she warmed between her palms, the rim darkened by years of mole stains, the heavy lump of dough on the comal that would become tortillas small and soft before the first bell. She wore her life like an apron, practical, constant, easily overlooked until something needed doing. The photograph lived in the fold of that apron, tucked beneath the hem where the heat of her body kept it steady. An oval portrait, yellowed at the edges, of a woman with the same mouth Rosa had, stern, patient, and a child on her lap. Rosa smoothed that paper with the same rhythm she smoothed linen, a gesture of private attention before the public labors of the day. The photograph was not rhetorical. It was the relic of a past that steadied her, an origin story she did not announce, but that steadied her through small cruelties and the slow erosions of class and rumor. In the soft hours, she sometimes pressed the picture to her chest and let herself be small enough for memory. She had been taken in at a late hour in other people's life, brought as a girl from a ruined town after the revolution, folded into service by Don Rafael Mendoza, when pity and need met his neat sense of providence. He was a tall man of patient appetite and a voice like low thunder. He collected names, cattle, and debts with equal care, ledgers in ink, keys on a ring, the exacting attention that kept Hacienda San Miguel an island of order and a place that otherwise floated by rumor and weather. In 2 decades, Rosa learned the house the way she learned a child's face. Every shutter that stuck in winter, which of the pear trees would ripen early, where the servants kept their coins if they saved them at all. She learned the hush of Don Rafael's chair each afternoon, the careful alignment of his spectacles by the lamp. Those small, invisible courtesies gave her a place not of property but of trust. She supervised the younger women as a mother might, turning a negligent eye into correction, a gentle hand into instruction. The children of laborers came to her when they skinned their knees, when they wanted more sweet at the edge of a feast. She bandaged and fed, named and scolded. The community called her Señora in tones that mixed respect and distance. Inside the quarters, the girls called her Doña Rosa. To the children, she was simply Rosa, warm, inevitable, safe. When Don Rafael's breath thinned across his nights and the house bent into waiting, Rosa adjusted her routine but not her devotion. She kept the lamp trimmed, she laid the cloth true, she folded shirts with the patient, precise motions of someone who understood that small disciplines keep a house from collapsing.
At the reading of his will, the family gathered in the dim parlor, where paintings watched like patient guests. Valentina, who wore jewelry like a challenge and gloves like armor, took her place close to the front. She was slight and shark-eyed, a niece who had been raised on the notion that wealth was an entitlement and that the house belonged by right to those whose blood was closest to Don Rafael's. The notary stood with a gravity learned in legal offices, with the sealed envelope under his palm like a sleeping bird. Leñato Fuentes handled papers as others handled prayer books. He was meticulous, old-fashioned in the way that men of his station had to be to survive the slippage of time. He read aloud the modest distributions, the parcels left to distant nephews, the cash that would be used for debts. For Rosa, there was a small bequest, a sum enough to cover a modest future, a gesture of recognition, but not a transformation. Then Fuentes lifted his eyes and announced the sealed testament. A hush fell like cloth over the room. The sealed envelope, folded and waxed, was a private thing that Don Rafael had left to the discretion of the notary. It would be opened only upon a stated condition, and that condition had been met, his death. The family drew in their breaths in different rhythms, Valentina with the quick, sharp intake of someone imagining a missing treasure, others with the slow, settling suspense of people whose fortunes were bound in the balance of paper. No one could say why the presence of that sealed fold made gossip congeal faster than smoke. Paper is a strange kind of truth. It rings with authority in a way that rumor cannot. It also attracts the eyes of those who have been waiting for a way to make desire seem legitimate. Valentina's silence after the reading was not peace, it was a calculation. That same afternoon, small things began to shift. Coins went missing from a servant's chest. A pocket meant for a lad who ran errands was found with empty linings. Lupita, who was young enough to still bend her head under authority and old enough to learn quick fear, was seen with 2 small, bright pieces in her palm and nothing more. She had hidden them under her apron at play, a childish hiding that could have been innocent, a move that in different hands would have been an end of a sentence rather than a beginning. Valentina watched Lupita with the kind of hunger that disguises itself as civility. She planted a look in the commissario's ear. "The servants have been taking. There are coins missing. You should see how they scurry." Rano Cordero, the commissario, liked a tidy world where disorder revealed itself quickly, and the law could be used to demonstrate authority. He came with boots that made his step sound like a verdict. Gossip, once given to him in the right tone, turned into investigation. Lupita, terrified and clumsy, could not explain that she had found the coins and hidden them for a later promise to a friend. When she was confronted in the kitchen under the copper pans and the smell of frying onions, she burst and said the least defensible thing, that Rosa had told her to hide them to make mischief. Statements were lodged like pebbles dropped into a well. The commissario listened. The foreman, Esteban, who had bruised loyalty to Don Rafael with a recent bribe, gave a terse account that later he would regret. And Valentina watched the echo of accusation expand into a sound that could be heard by every room in the house. The rhythm of suspicion beat loud over the quiet spaces where Rosa had always moved like a gentle current. Someone in the courtyard said aloud, 20 years serving and now this? As if longevity could be a measure of innocence and guilt at once, and as if gossip itself could be the rope that bound a woman. They did not shout. They did not need to. The commissario arrived with a public modesty that made it performative. He called for Rosa to explain. In the front courtyard with the mango tree under which the servants' churned clothes dried, she answered with the same equanimity she used to handle stubborn irons and sticky pots. Her voice when she spoke was flat with surprise. "I would not," she said, "take what does not belong to me." But a statement made by a woman of service is small against a crowd that wants scandal. Valentina's gloves were in her hands, the white of the fabric like a scribe's eraser. She produced a small fold of currency, coins glinting like accusation, and set them in the commissario's palm with an air of discovery. The young women who worked under Rosa down the line looked away. To admit they knew the truth would be to admit their own vulnerability. Esteban, who once owed Don Rafael money and had been forgiven, folded into the story a piece of testimony that fit the outline others were drawing. Rosa was ordered to leave the hacienda until the matter was resolved. The exile was a public ritual as old as, perhaps older than, the law. She was told to take her things. The house, which she had kept warm and ordered and running, required of her the shame of departure. She packed by the light of a wick, folding the photograph into a small cloth with more care than she folded her own shirt, taking the clay mug because its curve fit her hand, and because it was one of the few things she had that smelled of both home and use. They fastened no charms to her wrist. This was a legal separation, an exclusion performed with measured faces and the rust of old-class certainty. She left without spectacle, because spectacle would have dignified the accusation. She walked down the slope with her back straight. Townspeople she had counseled, the children she had bandaged, the women she had taught to pluck and tie and sew. Most of them watched from doorways with their hands over their mouths. Lupita held herself like a child who had choked on truth. Her face was a pale pleading. Padre Miguel took her in. The priest's room was small and smelled of lemon oil and beeswax. An oil lamp burned beneath a picture of a saint, and the priest moved with the soft gravity of someone whose life had been spent keeping sanctuary for others. He gave Rosa bread and a cot, and the house where she had once warmed another house, where she had warmed a man's evenings for 20 years, became for a night the place she came to be warmed. Padre Miguel did not ask the questions the commissario had asked. He offered a towel, a bowl, and a place to sit against the wall with the picture of a crucifix that watched over human misfortune as if cataloging it. "You are not alone," he said, and he meant it in the only way a priest can when law and gossip have done their work, that there would be someone to bury a body if a body needed burial, someone to shelter a woman if a woman needed shelter. His eyes were tired, but they were not surprised by cruelty. He had seen this kind of thing before, the way powerful households erased inconvenient presences with small sanctioned gestures. Rosa slept with the photograph beneath her pillow. In the wavering light, she thought of the children she had raised in patience, the way Arturo, the baker's boy, had once put a crown of grass on her head and declared her queen, the way the youngest Mendoza child had refused to drink tea if Rosa hadn't stirred it herself. Her identity as a mother had never been announced with a birth certificate. It had been enacted in scraped knees, in mended hems, in hands that smoothed ruffled hair. Title or no title, in the village register of care and affection, she existed as a mother, of the house, of the children, of the weary and the small who sought her steadiness. That night, the notary did not sleep. Lentiato Fuentes had the feeling of a man who had been made custodian of something that might tip the balance of a household. He had sat with Don Rafael in the months before the death, adjusting the spacing of a clause, translating private wishes into legal ticks, and he carried with him the sanctity that comes when your hands are trusted with a man's last directions. The sealed testament was a thing of wax and paper and phrase, a small monument to a private idea of justice. For Fuentes, the envelope was not only a cause of curiosity, it was part of an ethical architecture. A man may be dead, but his intentions remain in the instruments he leaves behind. To open without cause would be to violate a trust. To refuse to open when the cause had been declared would be to deny that trust the warmth of life. He sat, fingers tired from repeated movements, and thought of the wax on that fold, that deep ridged circle stamped with Don Rafael's seal, and he waited for the legal condition to be affirmed by the public clerk. He had a lamp, a ledger, and the slow certainty that the law moves like the tide, relentless and ineluctable. While Rosa slept in the priest's small room, men in the town debated the spectacle as if it were a card trick whose revelation would tell them which hands had been clever enough to win. Valentina, whose social life had always been measured by what she kept and what she displayed, moved among the relatives with the soft guile of someone who knows how to make a falsehood look like a truth. She let it be known, through the cousin who favored gossip, through the maid who liked to look in the washing, through the commissario himself, that the house had been betrayed by its own. There are economies of rumor. Some invest small lies heavily, trading them like coin until they become common currency. In the days that followed, the town's rhythm changed. The market that had hummed with bargaining now included the low undercurrent of speculation. What would happen if the sealed testament named an outsider? Who would inherit the orchards and the cattle? Who would manage the workers? People's faces narrowed into a new apprehension. The household, the social skeleton of a place like this, depended on clear lines of authority. Any question left unanswered began to gnaw at those lines. Rosa moved through the priest's house with the slowness of someone adjusting to exile. She picked up stray odd jobs, stitching a community woman's dress, sweeping the chapel, cooking soup for the sick. The children of the village came to her as they always had, and she told them stories in the doorway, how a woman can be a leader because she keeps things, because she sees the small needs of others, because she does not make her worth out of boasting, but by service. Yet in private, she allowed herself a small, steady fragility. She took out the photograph and traced the woman's mouth with the tip of a finger. She allowed herself to imagine what would happen if the paper in the notary's hands named her openly. She did not formulate plans for revenge. Her mind bent to simpler hopes, that her name be cleared so she might be able to return and rest without the weight of accusation, so the children who came to her plate might not have to watch her leave again. When Fuentes finally announced that the sealed envelope should be opened, it did not feel like theater. He made a public note in the ledger, the kind of writing that lands like a bell on the well of rumor. He sent for witnesses and for the registrar, and he asked that the reading be performed in the courtyard, public, dignified, legal. The men who had given testimony received the formal notice as if the world had tilted for a fraction and then taken a new axis. Esteban kept his face as if carved. Lupita's mother wrung her hands. Valentina, who had warmed herself on the anticipation of vindication, tightened her necklace as if to keep anchors from slipping.
There were practicalities to check: where the envelope had been stored, the condition of the seal, whether any competent authority could attest that it had not been tampered with. Dr. Ramirez, who had tended Don Rafael in his last days, and who had notes in his own hand regarding the man's lucidity, sent a slip to the notary, saying that the testator had been of sound mind when he had given the directive concerning the seal. It was a small, clinical certitude, but in the world of paper, it mattered. The law lives in ink, but it is propped by witnesses who carry the same breath of certainty into the ledger. The notary adjusted the wick of his lamp and arranged the small table in his office as he would a surgeon preparing instruments. He took the envelope into his hands and held it there a long time, as if he might learn the secret by touch alone. His fingers felt the slight give of paper and the hard ridge where wax had been impressed. When he ran a finger along the edge, the wax made a small, muffled sound, like a man hiding a laugh. He thought of Don Rafael's voice, discreet, decisive, and he felt in that private moment the dignity of his vocation. News that the notary intended to open the envelope traveled through the town like a weather change. People began to collect in the square with an old hunger, some in hope, some in fear, others with the interest that comes with rumor. Rosa heard it in the way the children ticked their chairs when they spoke of the reading, in the way the women inched closer in the market to catch a rumor and then flinch away. She felt a small, dry bloom of fear in her chest, a natural response to a truth that might undo her. Valentina, for her part, assumed the posture of someone who had owned the future for so long that the act of asserting ownership had become reflex. She circulated among the relatives like a wind of small fripperies, letting her whispers take on an accusatory tone that read like a sermon. If the notary named Rosa, she would have to be prepared to argue, to insist, to find someone's testimony to outweigh a paper. Accusation had a manner and a smell. Valentina used it like perfume. She moved among those who could be persuaded and made a gentle case. What would happen if the house were mismanaged? Who would look after the accounts? Her fear was a clear self-interest dressed as preservation. Rosa, meanwhile, sat with Padre Miguel in the cool chapel and tried to count the ways she had made herself useful to a life, not to accumulate credit, but because usefulness had been her language. She did not rage against Valentina. She remembered the night she had first come to the hacienda and how Don Rafael had given her a bowl of hot stew and a promise of room. She remembered how he had laughed at the kitchen door when she stacked plates. Memory made the accusations feel not only unfair but unbecoming. The world that had given her shelter could now abandon the covenant of mutual regard.
At the notary's office the next morning, the courtly bustle that attends a small public drama arrived. Parents with children, the curious and the invested, a smattering of the poor who read other people's fortunes for sport. Fuentes bowed to duty and set out chairs. He called witnesses, and he arranged the envelope upon the table as if setting a heart upon cloth. His hands were steady, his voice was explicitly neutral, the practiced low timbre of a man who knows appearances can be sharp and must be treated with care. The first witness was a housekeeper whose ledger entries could speak to who had been given what by Don Rafael during his life, the way he authorized coin for certain repairs, the way he made companionate, quiet decisions that were rarely foghorned. She spoke about the quiet favors, the plantings watered without mention, the particularities of who Don Rafael had consulted in the small crises of the estate. Next came the foreman, Esteban, who had spoken before and now cast his face with the wariness of small culpability. He offered an account that folded like paper into apology, that he had seen coins moved and had not asked, that he had presumed and had been wrong in watching rather than asking. Lupita shivered when she came forward. She was small enough to still be forgiven for childish fear, and she told the truth with the trembling honesty of the young. She had found coins, she had hidden them, she had been frightened, and in that fear she had spoken a thing that was not the whole truth, but rather a shattered part of it. Valentina watched all of this with the thin temper of a woman who realizes accusations cannot be retracted with the same ease they are made. The public rehearsal of the servant's statements did not dramatize a classic legal showdown so much as it revealed the social anatomy of a small town. Who trusts whom? Who eats with whom? Who will speak when push comes to shove? When the notary slid a small knife against the wax and heard the papery sound, the crowd inhaled with the measured etiquette of people who had attended births, weddings, and funerals without being experts in any of them. The wax cracked with a particular sound that is deciduous, like shells splitting to let the seed of meaning out. Fuentes lifted the flap, and as he prepared to read aloud, there stretched in the street a silence that tasted like rain. Rosa stood at the edge of the square with Padre Miguel and a few loyal neighbors. Her hands were empty but for the photograph, and the clay mug hung in the crook of an arm like a talisman. She watched the notary's shoulders, the slow opening of an old man's speech. For a moment she allowed herself to hope that paper would do the work she could not, that the ink of Don Rafael's intention would be as steady as the work Rosa had done. A boy from the corner cried out for a dog. Someone rustled. Valentina's face was a mask of anticipation, the kind you see on people who have practiced the pose of triumph in the mirror. In her pocket, coins jangled like accusation. No one yet spoke the name that might be in the paper. Nothing could prepare them for that precise syllable if it came. Nothing could predict the exactness of a legal pronouncement that would reform a life. The envelope lay in the notary's hands like an object waiting for benediction. It was then, as the knife almost met the wax, that Lupita's mother pushed through the crowd and called out in a voice that made the air shiver. She did not call for mercy for her daughter. She called for truth. Her words were simple and shameful. Remember the morning the coins were found. Remember who else was in the kitchen. You all saw. Valentina's smile flickered. The square seemed to hold its breath between the crack of the wax and the reading of the first line. The notary adjusted his spectacles and, with a small, deliberate motion, let his thumb find that first phrase that could change the course of many lives. The knife met the wax and then stopped. For a breath, the world held itself between the sound of the crack and the next motion. Lentiato Fuentes let the thin silver slide a fraction farther, and the crack lengthened like a line drawn through rumor. The flap lifted, paper unfolded with the slow courtesy of an old ritual. It made a sound like dry leaves moved by a careful hand. Fuentes read in a voice that had been schooled to carry no triumph. To Rosa Hernandez, he said, and the name dropped into the square with the calm of a thing finally put in its place. The syllables were ordinary, identical to how he would have sounded if he were dictating a ledger entry, but the air around them thickened. Valentina's mouth tightened. A hush that had been waiting a lifetime pressed itself into the faces of those assembled. He did not stop at the name. The document unfolded a string of particulars with the precise, unemotional cadence of a man translating another person's final will into the public record. Don Rafael's hand, in the months before his breath thinned, had left instructions not only of coin and land, but of care. He named her explicitly, not merely an employee or a long-serving hand, but someone he recognized for the way she kept the household's life true. He left her a life annuity sufficient to live with comfort, a parcel of land adjacent to the East Orchard, and most drastically, for those who had presumed otherwise, the responsibility to manage the domestic ledgers and to recommend the hiring of a house physician and a teacher for the workers' children. He writes, Fuentes read on, that Rosa Hernandez has been more than a servant. She has been the steward of his days and the keeper of his household's trust.
She shall be provided for, and shall be given authority to oversee the domestic accounts, and to propose, within reason, improvements for the well-being of those who live and labor at Hacienda San Miguel. The crowd reacted as if a bell had rung with a double stroke. Some faces softened, others hardened. Valentina's composure, like a thin paper mask, began to fracture along edges the public now exposed. It was one thing to imagine power, and another to hear it named aloud for a woman who had been trained for 2 decades to make herself small. Fuentes lifted his head and drew a breath that pulled the next line free. In addition, he continued, the testator leaves certain personal effects to be recognized and returned: a clay mug, a photograph in a cloth, and a small iron key, to be kept by the beneficiary. The notary's eyes swept the square and found Rosa where she stood, her fingers still pressed to the photograph she would not let out of her hands. Murmurs ran through the crowd like wind. That particular sentence landed with the weight of evidence. The clay mug was hers. Everyone had seen her warm it by the fogon for years. To read its name aloud was to convert the small domestic certainty into a legal truth. The iron key, some thought, might be a key to a trunk or a lock on a storeroom. The photograph was named as something that must be returned and preserved. Objects that had belonged for a lifetime to the constancy of routine were now given the heft of testament. Valentina's voice, when it came, was thin and forced. She insisted that the reading could be an error. She proposed procedural questions as if a legal technicality might undo the pronouncement of a dying man. She suggested, with a practiced softness, that perhaps some other document would alter the reading. Her hands, white with gloves, fidgeted as she spoke. But the notary's ledger and the stamps at his side were solid things. Dr. Ramirez's slip about Don Rafael's lucidity had already been registered, and the witnesses had been sworn. The law, when called in, is not easily swayed by the gusts of a niece's impatience. Then Fuentes did what no one had expected at the outset. He unrolled an inner page that read not only a name and token, but a charge. There, in ink that had been pressed with deliberation, Don Rafael asked that Rosa be empowered to propose reforms to the household, improved rations, a modest medical stipend, and the hiring of a schoolmistress for the children of workers. He had gone further. He directed that a portion of income from the newly named parcel be set aside to fund these measures. It was a small reallocation of wealth. It was a seismic shift in how the household's moral life would be managed. The crowd's reaction was no longer only about who would live where or who would sign which paper. The paper itself had become a moral compass, pointing in a direction they had not expected. Voices rose, some with relief, others with alarm.
The men who had once assumed power by lineage found themselves confronted by a man's private wish that a woman whose hands had made the house run be given an official hand in its governance. Valentina's objections sharpened into accusation. "This is manipulation," she said. "You cannot let a servant dictate affairs of property." Her words were an effort to reframe Don Rafael's intention as an affront to tradition rather than an act of gratitude. She took from her pocket the same coins she had used to stage the theft and let them clang on the table as if to puncture the notary's solemnity. A few of her relatives clucked in approval. Others felt the thinness of such theatrics. At that moment, a small, wavering voice rose from the crowd. Esteban stepped forward, the foreman who had earlier given testimony that now sat like a stone in his throat. He had been a man of habit, and habit sometimes shields guilt. His face looked carved with the work of the seasons. His hands had the callous of one who steered teams of animals and men. He cleared his throat and then spoke in a voice that had been muffled by his own earlier silence. "I was wrong," he said simply,
and the plainness of his admission struck the square with a new bluntness. He told the truth in a way he had not when he had been cradled by the implicit protection of Don Rafael's house, that he had seen coins moved, yes, but that he had not seen Rosa touch them, that he had trusted a look and had never knocked on the room to ask. His apology was long in coming and short of words, but it was a start. He looked at Rosa not with the gaze of a man who owned the place, but with the humility of one who had been wrong. Lupita, who had hid the coins and then offered a frightened account, was called to speak next. She stood like a child in a theater of grown persons, small shoulders lifting beneath the heat of shame. She told the truth as children tell it when fear has unknotted into remnant courage, that she had found the coins, that she had been frightened, that she had said things she did not mean. She named Valentina's presence in the kitchen that day, and that she had, in the scatter of panic, shown the coins to a lady who had then suggested to the commissario that servants were thieving. Valentina's composure crumpled in the way brittle things do when exposed to rain. The necklace she had tried to clutch as armor slipped against her throat. She offered muttered denials, and then, to no one in particular, she offered an admission too small to be generous. Her voice betrayed a trembling when someone in the crowd, one of the workers whose child Rosa had taught to read, spoke up in her favor. "She is our mother," he said, simple and fierce. "She is the hand who taught my girl to read and who gave my wife the needle to sew." What the evening would remember was not a cage of scandal, but the shape of a return. Dr. Ramirez, called forward once more, spoke to Don Rafael's mental state. He confirmed the old man's lucidity when the decision had been made. He spoke not with triumph, but with the carefulness of a physician attesting to a record. His testimony was small but essential. It made the ink look like the hand of a man who knew what he was doing when he chose to name Rosa in his final days. By the time Fuentes reached the final clauses, the reading had transformed into something like confession and covenant. Don Rafael had written, in the tone of a man who had been generous and deliberate, that Rosa should not only be given provision, but also entrusted to care for the people who kept his estate moving. He had written that the ledger, kept by the house, kept scrupulously, should be opened to certain eyes, and that an internal account be kept of rations and wages. He had asked that a small part of his estate be used to build a modest clinic and a one-room school, and that Rosa, in her role as domestic manager, be allowed to propose the initial functions of each. The words were as practical as they were symbolic. No fanfare, no overturning of what social custom had held for years, rather an honest attempt by a dying man to translate gratitude into ongoing structures. It was as if, in his last days, Don Rafael had understood that kindness bought in acts must be safeguarded by paper and law if it was to outlast the precariousness of habit and rumor. Valentina's protests became thinner as the reading continued. She pressed her palms into her lap and spoke to imagined allies who had begun to look away. The public nature of Fuentes' reading had made gossip submit to testimony. The notary's methodical voice had reframed private rumor into public record. The effect of the whole was ordinary and radical at once. A household's moral ledger was being rebalanced. When the notary finished, a hush stretched across the square. Rosa's shoulders were not thrown with triumph. They had the quiet steadiness of someone who understood the serious work of being named. She folded the photograph against her chest as if holding a lit candle. Her eyes met Esteban's for a moment. There was apology there, and something like mutual recognition of a shared human frailty. Fuentes did not allow for a dramatic triumph. He insisted that certain formalities be observed. A record would be entered into the municipal ledger, signatures would be taken, a small committee would be formed to oversee the initial steps for the clinic and the school. He called for those present whose testimony had been given to sign and to have their statements recorded. It was a sober procedural cadence that tempered jubilation with the forward motion of governance. Outside the formalities, there were other reckonings to be made. Valentina's relatives stood about her like a dismayed flock. She had hoped for the disappearance of another woman to tidy her path toward what she felt entitled to, and now she found herself exposed.
She was not hanged in public. She was asked, in the slow and certain way the law knows how, to account for what she had done. The small theft she had staged, those coins glinted like the evidence of something smaller, of character, had begun to undo her claims. There was no mob, and there were no shouts of revenge. The people of the town, many of them who had known Rosa for years as their midwife of small crises, moved through relief and embarrassment. Some of the older women wept quietly and stepped forward to embrace Rosa. Lupita's mother kissed Rosa's hands in the sudden and messy gratitude for a truth restored. The children, who had been taught to stitch by Rosa, pressed to her skirts and wanted to make of her the center of their relief. She did not refuse them. She patted heads the way she had always patted them, without ceremony, with a steadying hand. In the days that followed, the formal steps Fuentes had mentioned took shape. A committee met in the municipal house. Fuentes chaired it. Dr. Ramirez supplied certain clinical suggestions, and Padre Miguel agreed to help find a schoolmistress, a woman who could teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to the children of the workers. They drafted a modest set of reforms that would be enacted immediately: clearer ledgers, a regular stipend for medical visits, improvements in rationing so that the men who toiled in the fields would have consistent provisions, and an allocation for a small clinic. Don Rafael's parcel, the East Lot, would produce a small rent that would fund these measures. The negotiations were not theatrical. They were the slow, careful work of people learning to translate paper into real change. Rosa sat in the small council and spoke in the same unadorned voice she used in the kitchen. She did not demand revenge or retribution. She asked that record-keeping be transparent, that wages be recorded in an open ledger, and that women who worked be given the chance to voice grievances without fear of instant exile. It was the language of management, modest and practical, the language shaped by someone who had kept a house running for decades. Valentina, bitter and defensive, tried to argue for the maintenance of certain privileges the family had enjoyed. She raised the specter of mismanagement as a reason to limit Rosa's authority, but the ledger, inked in Fuentes' hand, backed by the notary solemnity, favored Don Rafael's explicit wish. The council signed a preliminary memorandum. A public apology would be offered to Rosa in front of the household, and a schedule for the reforms would be established. A committee, including Rosa herself, would oversee the distribution of funds for the clinic and the school. The moment of public apology was tender and formal. In the same courtyard where Rosa had left under a polite compulsion, Valentina stood before them all and read a short, shamed statement.
She said, in clipped tones, that she had allowed ambition and fear to overrule decency, and that she would apologize for the harm she had caused. Her words were not easily given. An apology can be a creature of pride, and yet she unlatched it, syllable by heavy syllable. She did not try to restore trust in a single breath. Instead, she set down a promise to reconstruct what she had helped to break. Esteban offered a public apology as well, voice rough with contrition, and put his hand to his heart as if to literalize the weight he had carried. Lupita, in a small show of regained dignity, apologized for the part her fear had played and promised to work and learn. The communal atmosphere ripened into something like repair. It was not perfect. There were eyes that would always measure relationships by lineage, and others that would learn new measures of worth by service and mutual care. Rosa returned to the hacienda with the photograph in a clean cloth and the clay mug at her hip. She entered the house quietly, not as a conqueror, but as someone who had been given a task and intended to do the work. The rooms looked the same, and yet nothing was unchanged. People who had once kept a cool distance came forward to greet the woman who had always been at the center of small domestic economies. Some kissed her hand. Some, awkwardly, offered the spare courtesies that persons of rank may extend to those they have wronged. Her first act, quiet as a breath, was not to lock anyone in judgment. She requested that the ledgers be placed in a central room where the workers might view them if they wished. She asked that a small meeting of workers be called once a month so that grievances could be aired. She insisted with a particular firmness that a nurse be hired for the clinic Dr. Ramirez proposed, and that a teacher be appointed within 2 months. The committee, led by Fuentes, Dr. Ramirez, Padre Miguel, and Rosa, set the dates and drew up a plan. In the following weeks, they began to repair those things that habit and neglect had allowed to fray. Beds in the servants' quarters were mended and replaced where they had become lumpy with years of use. The kitchen storekeeper took upstairs a new set of pans and a ledger for rations written in Rosa's careful hand. A teacher named Senora Alvarez arrived from the next town and took the single room of the former storehouse to begin classes for the children. There was no fanfare, no brass band, no dramatic ribbon cutting, but the sound of children learning to read filled that cracking-in-places house with a different kind of noise. Rosa supervised the ledger in the mornings. She learned the precise strokes of the accounting hand that Fuentes insisted on and taught the cook to note exact distributions. Where once small slippages had been made casually, here an extra loaf for a favored nephew, there a ration miscount, paper now held an account of the house's moral life.
Rosa's handwriting, at first awkward in the ledgers, found its own steady rhythm. She signed names without fanfare. She kept records not with the sharpness of mistrust, but with the clarity of someone who wanted things to be fair. Her leadership was not ostentatious. It was the work of checking if the midwives had enough supplies, of reminding the foreman to speak respectfully to the workers, of making sure drugs were stocked in the tiny clinic. She did not take to the mansion's council with a hunger for spectacle. Rather, she visited rooms, mended fences, and listened. Workers who had felt invisible now had a space to speak. A man who had been mole in the field found easier access to a nurse when his cough worsened. A small girl of 7 began to learn to spell her name. The reforms were not instant miracles. Change is a long stitch. It takes the length of months and the persistence of small people. The clinic's first nurse had to be persuaded to stay. The teacher's salary needed a supplement until the East parcel's rents began to come in. There were disputes over boundaries of land. There were days when Valentina's resentments leaked into gossip. But the ledger, the clinic, and the school were real and having real effects. Among the quieter triumphs were things that could not be measured in a ledger. The way the youngest son of a field worker no longer had to walk 3 miles to fetch a doctor when he was febrile. The way women began to gather under the mango tree in evenings and speak freely of concerns that had always been swallowed. Rosa presided over these small gatherings, not as an overlord, but as someone who had been trusted by a man who understood the value of care. She insisted on a soft kind of democracy in the house that had always preferred a hard, inherited order. Valentina's place at the midday table changed. She was not exiled to shame, but neither was she restored to the ease of entitlement. She attended the meetings and slowly took the awkward steps of someone learning to live within new terms. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she watched. There were moments of friction, but Rosa steered with an even hand. She would correct Valentina when records were misread, roll out a ledger page for her to see, and place into explanation rather than rebuke. It was a leadership formed by stewardship rather than hectoring. It asked people to account rather than to be shamed into submission. 6 months later, the effects of the legal recognition could be seen in small, concrete ways. The school had a rough but neat building with a blackboard and a small bench. The children sat in 2 rows and learned to read syllables that had once been foreign. The clinic had a cot and a small cabinet of bandages and tonics. Dr. Ramirez stopped in twice a week to oversee things and to teach a young woman in the village basic nursing care. The ledgers sat in a room with a window. Anyone with a grievance could ask to see the entries and have them explained.
Esteban married a woman from the next valley. It was not a grand wedding, but a modest celebration of a man who had taken responsibility and, in doing so, had been offered a new measure of grace. Lupita remained at the hacienda and, under Rosa's patient instruction, learned to stitch and to tend accounts. Her eyes, which had once been startled and quick, now held a steadier look, as if relief had settled into place. Even Valentina, whose edges had been sharpened by disappointment and privilege, began to find small work in the library, cataloging trunks and correspondence, modest tasks that both humbled and steadied her. Rosa herself kept the clay mug and the photograph. The photograph was cleaned and gently framed by Rosa's own hands. She set it in the small room that would serve as both her modest office and a place where the poor could come for counsel. The mug sat on the windowsill and was used for tea in the mornings by the nurse and by Rosa when she sat to sign a ledger or review requisitions. Her maternal claim grew in the village register in ways the census never recorded. Mothers of children who learned to read came to her and kissed her hands. A baker's boy who had once made crowns pressed wild grasses in her hair on feast days. The village, which had once murmured at her departure, now greeted her with a deeper kind of respect. She did not seek adulation. She sought fairness, and the public acknowledged that this was a reasonable thing to ask for. One evening, late in the softer stretch of a harvest, Rosa stood at the doorway and watched children leave the school with chubby hands balled around paper pages. The light slanted through the dust like a blessing. A boy she had once bandaged ran up and offered her a slice of sweet fig, more out of love than ceremony. She accepted it and sat on a low step, the clay mug warming in her hands. Her photograph, now framed, leaned against a shelf inside. A key hung on a nail, small and ironed with time. Padre Miguel came by with his slow, kind smile and sat beside her. "You have become more than they planned," he said gently, and she smiled with the modest satisfaction of someone who had been given the work of care and had taken it up with diligence. "In some ways," she answered, "I am still the same woman who warmed the house before dawn." Her voice held the hard-earned softness of someone who had been tested. He nodded toward the courtyard where a woman in the new clinic bandaged the hand of an old laborer. "And in other ways, you are what the paper spoke into being," he said. "You have taken a paper and turned it into living things." She thought of Don Raphael for a moment, of the patience of a man who had, in death, reached toward fairness.
She thought of Valentina, who had been human in her hunger and small in her errors. She thought of Lupita and Esteban, and all the small hands that had made a life. Her thoughts stretched with gratitude and concern both. Gratitude for the restoration of her name, and concern for the patience it would require to make this restoration durable. A few months later, a modest ceremony was held to acknowledge the new arrangements. It was not a spectacle, but a formal blessing. Fuentes read from the ledger, Dr. Ramirez offered a prayer for health, and the teacher, Senora Alvarez, performed a short recitation of the children's first learned syllables. The housekeeper, who had watched Rosa's life for decades, put down a cake in the kitchen, not to celebrate a triumph, but to acknowledge continuity and care, and the workers sang an old song about planting and harvest. Valentina stood at the edge, hands folded, and when the crowd called Rosa forward, she did not refuse the call, but stepped back to rearrange herself into a different posture. When the formalities ended, the people returned to the rhythms of work, but the difference lay in the small protocols now in place. A man could not be cast out without recorded cause. A woman could appeal a ration discrepancy and have it entered by 2 witnesses. The ledger, inked in careful script, and sometimes in Rosa's own hand, sat under glass in a room where anyone could petition to see it. The clay mug was placed ceremonially beside the framed photograph when meetings were held. It had become a talisman of recognition, rather than a mere domestic object. People asked Rosa, sometimes, whether she would punish Valentina. The question sat like a mirror to their own hunger for a dramatic ending. Rosa considered such things with the same steady caution she applied to ledgers. "Punishment is not my work," she said once to Padre Miguel. "My work is to steward what has been given and to make sure the children have what they need." Her refusal to enact vengeance was not weakness. It was a deliberate moral choice. She saw in Valentina's face the wasted potential of resentment, and she preferred to convert power into structures that could protect many. She insisted on an apprenticeship program for younger women to learn the ledgers and the nursing cabinet. She fought for a schedule that allowed those who worked fields to visit the clinic without losing wages. She insisted, gently but firmly, that everyone who lived at Hacienda San Miguel be treated with a measure of dignity. These were not heroic strokes, but steady ones. A ledger kept properly, a nurse's salary paid on time, a cupboard with medicines. Over months, the house's moral economy softened the sharp edges that rumor had once serrated. People began to talk about the house's change not as abolition of old custom, but as a new kind of prudence. At dusk, months after the reading, Rosa sat by the low window and cleaned the photograph's frame. The glass had some spots she had not yet wiped. The edge of the frame caught the light like a small halo.
She set the clay mug down and ran her fingers over the iron key that hung from a nail near the shelf. The key was nothing spectacular. It was a small iron thing with the wear of use. But when she slided it between her fingers, the way one might slide a prayer into a Bible, she felt the steady weight of the covenant that had been made, that a man's last wish had been honored, and that those wishes would be translated into the smallest acts of care. A child of the village, one of those whose name she had taught to spell, poked his head in, cheeks flushed from playing. "Doña Rosa," he said, "today I learned the first part of my name. Look." He held out a page with careful scrawled letters. She smiled without grandeur and took the paper. She had sat with children like him in doorways for years, but this felt different because it was public now. His learning was not a private grace, but part of a household reoriented toward the life of many. "It is your name," she said, and the simplicity of it felt like benediction. When the town had sorely needed an example of small mercy turned into public policy, it had awaited a great man or a dramatic leader. Instead, it had received something quieter: paper, ink, and a woman who kept the house. That combination had shifted more than property lines. It had made a new vocabulary for how a household's life might be conducted, less on the basis of gossip and more on the basis of accountable, recorded practice. Rosa's last public act in this long arc was as unadorned as everything else she did. When a young woman came to complain that her husband had been shorted a ration, Rosa walked with her to the ledgers. She showed the entries, explained the accounting, and listened until the woman left with a clear understanding of how the correction would be made. The woman's gratitude was immediate and plain. For Rosa, that small exchange was the epitome of the work she had been given to do. It was not about vengeance. It was about the slow conversion of rumor into record and the gentle extension of being seen.
In the quiet light of an evening, when the harvest smell clung sweet to the air, Rosa stood on the courtyard steps and watched the lights come on in the room she had always tended. The children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse. The clay mug warmed her palms, and the photograph in its frame caught a final blush of afternoon. She touched the key that hung at the nail and thought of Don Rafael with a complicated gratitude. She thought of Valentina, whom she had not shunned, but whom she hoped would learn that power can be used to provide rather than to exclude. If anyone were to ask what had changed about Rosa, the answer would be complicated. She had been named and thus provided for. She had been given responsibility. She had turned that responsibility not into a throne, but into the mundane apparatus of care. Her life was not sudden triumph. It was steadied by the weight of duty and the small miracles of repair.
The town, when it spoke of what had happened at Hacienda San Miguel, told a story that accepted the ugliness of rumor, the cruelty of accusation, and the eventual humbling effect of a legal instrument that mattered. They would tell how a sealed envelope, a waxed paper, and a man's final ink had done what gossip could not, restore a name. They would also tell how Rosa, who had always been a mother in gestures more than in certificate, had chosen to steward that restored name into structures that made life slightly kinder for many. In the end, the law had named her. She had remade what the name could hold. If this story reached you and touched something, if it made you think about the small acts that sustain a community, or about how paper and care can be twin forms of truth, leave a note below. Tell us, would you have forgiven Valentina? For now, Rosa cleaned the mug, set it beside the framed photograph, and turned down the lamp. The house settled around her like a long inhalation. Outside, the children slept, and the orchard kept its soft watch. She closed her eyes, and for a moment allowed herself a private breath of relief, the kind that comes when a night's work is done, and the world keeps turning by the steadiness of small hands.